My name is Harold Thompson, and I've been driving school buses for 32 years through the dust and heat of Arizona's endless highways. But this isn't just another tale about mechanical breakdowns and roadside emergencies. This is about how a routine trip home from Phoenix became the day I discovered that divine interventions sometimes wear work boots and carry messages that cut straight through 43 years of stubborn pride, and how a complete stranger's simple words about my father would force me to confront the most painful chapter of my life, just when I thought it was too late to rewrite the ending. It was September 22nd, a Thursday evening when the temperature was still hovering around 95 degrees, despite the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains, and I was driving my empty bus back to Flagstaff after delivering a group of high school seniors to a college orientation program in Phoenix. Mile marker 189 on Interstate 40, that's exactly where the engine started, making that grinding noise that every veteran driver knows means serious trouble is coming fast, and within 2 minutes, I was coasting to a stop on the shoulder of one of America's loneliest stretches of highway, with nothing but desert scrub and distant mountains for company. When I turned off the ignition and stepped out into the dry evening air, the silence was complete except for the ticking of cooling metal and the occasional whistle of wind through the Joshua trees that dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels watching over travelers who'd lost their way. At 67 years old, I'd handled plenty of mechanical emergencies over the decades, but this felt different somehow, like the breakdown was less about faulty engine parts and more about forces beyond my understanding, deciding it was time for me to stop running from conversations I'd been avoiding for nearly half a century. The engine compartment revealed what I'd suspected from the sound: a thrown rod that had punched a hole clean through the engine block, the kind of catastrophic failure that means you're not driving anywhere under your own power for the foreseeable future. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given how far I was from the nearest town, and the approaching darkness was already beginning to paint the desert in shades of purple and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. That's when I saw him walking toward me from the east, a figure in white clothing that seemed to glow against the darkening landscape, moving with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why he needed to get there. At first I thought it might be a mirage, one of those desert tricks that make desperate travelers see things that aren't really there, but as he got closer, I could see he was real enough. Probably in his 70s, with silver hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work under the southwestern sun. "Looks like you've got some trouble there," he said as he approached, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that made you want to trust him immediately, even though everything about the situation should have made me suspicious of a stranger appearing out of nowhere in the middle of the desert, just when I needed help most. He was wearing work clothes that were somehow spotlessly white, despite the dusty environment, and his boots showed no signs of the long walk he must have made to reach my location. "Engines shot," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand and wondering how this man had managed to walk across miles of desert without looking even slightly overheated or tired. "Thrown rod, hole in the block, she's finished for good. Been driving buses for over 30 years, and I've never seen one fail quite this completely before." He nodded with the understanding that comes from someone who spent plenty of time around mechanical equipment, then looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than just the surface of things, the kind of penetrating gaze that makes you feel like all your secrets and regrets are written across your face for anyone who knows how to read them. "Harold Thompson," he said, though I was certain I'd never introduced myself, "you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, haven't you?" The use of my name should have alarmed me, but instead it felt oddly comforting, like running into an old friend in an unexpected place, even though I was absolutely certain I'd never seen this man before in my life. "I'm sorry, do we know each other? I don't recall meeting you, and I'm usually pretty good with faces after all these years of dealing with parents and school administrators." He smiled with the kind of patience that suggested he had all the time in the world and no intention of rushing through whatever conversation was about to unfold between us on this empty stretch of highway. "We haven't met before today, Harold, but I know about the weight you've been carrying since 1981. The burden that's been growing heavier every year, you've let it sit unattended in your heart. I know about the argument with your father that sent you storming out of the house in Sedona, and I know about the 43 years of silence that followed. The mention of 1981 hit me like a physical blow, because that was the year everything fell apart between my father and me, The year our relationship died in a storm of angry words and wounded pride that neither of us seemed capable of surviving. Robert Thompson had been a traditional man who believed sons should follow in their father's footsteps, and when I announced my intention to leave the family construction business to pursue a career in education, he took it as a personal rejection of everything he'd worked to build and everything he'd hoped to pass down to the next generation. "That was a long time ago," I managed to say, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended, betrayed by emotions I thought I'd buried deep enough that they couldn't hurt me anymore. Some things can't be fixed, no matter how much time passes or how much we might wish they could be different. The man in white stepped closer, and I noticed that despite the desert heat and the dust that should have been stirred up by the evening breeze, his clothes remained perfectly clean, as if the ordinary rules of physics didn't quite apply to him the way they did to everyone else. "Your father is 89 years old now, Harold. He's been living in the Golden Years Care Facility in Sedona for the past 2 years, ever since his stroke made it impossible for him to maintain the house where you grew up. Every day he asks the nurses if anyone has called asking about Robert Thompson, and every day they have to tell him no. The information about my father's condition and whereabouts should have been impossible for this stranger to know, but somehow hearing it spoken aloud in the growing darkness of the desert felt less like an invasion of privacy and more like a gift I'd been too stubborn to ask for, but desperately needed to receive. I'd lost contact with everyone in Sedona after that terrible fight in 1981, burning bridges with such thorough determination that I'd managed to cut myself off from all news about my father's health, his circumstances, even whether he was still alive. "How could you possibly know all this about my family's situation?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer, because there are some questions that lead you into territory you're not prepared to navigate, some conversations that change everything about how you understand the world and your place in it. "Are you a social worker? A private investigator? Someone from the care facility?" He shook his head with that same patient smile, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made my heart stop beating for several long seconds. It was a photograph, creased and faded from years of handling, showing a young man in his 20s standing next to an older man in front of a partially constructed house, both of them grinning at the camera with the kind of easy affection that exists between fathers and sons before pride and stubbornness destroy everything good between them. "He carries this picture with him everywhere," the man said gently, holding the photograph so I could see it clearly in the fading light. "It's the only photo he has of the two of you together, taken in 1979 during the summer you helped him build the Morrison family's addition. He tells anyone who'll listen about how proud he was that day, how his son had inherited his eye for construction and his dedication to quality craftsmanship. I recognized the photo immediately because I'd had an identical copy in my wallet for 43 years, though I'd never admitted to anyone why I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, despite the pain it caused every time I accidentally glimpsed it while looking for my driver's license or credit cards. That summer of 1979 had been the last good season between my father and me, the final months before our relationship became a battleground of conflicting expectations and wounded feelings that ultimately destroyed everything we'd built together over the previous 24 years. "The thing he regrets most," the stranger continued, his voice taking on an urgency that cut through the evening air like a blade, "isn't that you chose a different career path, or that you decided education was more important than construction. What haunts him every single day is the way he reacted when you told him about your dreams, the cruel words he spoke in anger, the way he made you feel like your aspirations were somehow a betrayal of his love and sacrifice." The memory of that final argument came flooding back with painful clarity, every harsh word and wounded look preserved in perfect detail, despite 4 decades of trying to forget. My father had worked 16-hour days for years to build Thompson Construction into a successful business, sacrificing his health and his social life to create something meaningful he could pass down to his only son. And when I announced my intention to become a teacher instead of taking over the family company, he'd erupted with a fury that transformed our kitchen into a war zone of accusations and recriminations. "You're throwing away everything I've built," he'd shouted, his face red with anger and disappointment. "Everything I've sacrificed, every dream I've had about working alongside my son, every plan I've made for our future together. You're just tossing it all aside like it means nothing to you, like my life's work is something to be ashamed of instead of honored." My response had been equally harsh, and probably more hurtful because it came from a place of youthful certainty that brooked no compromise or understanding. I never asked you to sacrifice anything for me, and I never promised to live my life according to your dreams instead of my own. Just because you're afraid to let me make my own choices doesn't mean I have to spend the rest of my life trapped in a business that makes me feel like I'm suffocating. The stranger seemed to sense the direction of my thoughts because he nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested he'd witnessed similar family tragedies play out countless times over the years. He's been rehearsing what he'd say to you if he ever got the chance to apologize, Harold. For 43 years, he's been composing letters he never had the courage to send, practicing conversations he never believed would happen, hoping for a reconciliation he was too proud to initiate, but too heartbroken to stop dreaming about. As full darkness settled over the desert and the first stars began to appear in the clear Arizona sky, I found myself crying for the first time in decades, not just for the relationship I'd lost with my father, but for all the years we'd both spent carrying around guilt and regret that could have been healed with a simple conversation if either of us had been brave enough to reach out first. The man in white waited patiently while I processed emotions I'd been avoiding for most of my adult life, giving me the space I needed to feel everything I'd been running from since that terrible day in 1981. Now, before I continue with what happened next in the desert, I need to pause and speak directly to those of you who are listening to this story, because something tells me that many of you understand exactly what it feels like to carry around unfinished business with people you love, regrets that grow heavier with each passing year, conversations you keep postponing until someday becomes never. If you've made it this far in Harold's journey, it's because you recognize something of your own story in his struggle, something of your own heart in his decades of stubborn silence that hurt both him and his father in ways neither of them intended. This isn't just entertainment for you, is it? This is a mirror reflecting back all the times you've let pride win battles that love should have won, all the moments you've chosen being right over being connected, all the relationships you've let slip away because apologizing felt too dangerous or too complicated or too late. Every person listening right now has someone in their life they need to call, someone they need to forgive, someone they need to ask for forgiveness from. And hearing about Harold's desert encounter is reminding you that time is the most precious gift we have, and wasting it on stubbornness is the cruelest thing we can do to ourselves and the people who matter most. If this story is stirring up memories of your own unfinished conversations, your own family members you've been too proud to reach out to, your own regrets that keep you awake at night wondering what might have been different if you'd just swallowed your pride and picked up the phone, then I want you to know you've found exactly the right place. This channel isn't just about telling stories. It's about creating a community where people who understand the cost of broken relationships can find hope, healing, and the courage to start mending what's been torn apart by time and stubbornness and wounded pride. Hit that subscribe button not because you want to be entertained, but because you believe in the power of second chances, because you understand that love is always stronger than pride when we finally find the courage to choose connection over being right. Leave a comment and tell us about the person you need to forgive or the person you need to ask for forgiveness from. Share your own stories of family relationships that got broken somewhere along the way. Let us know about the conversations you've been avoiding and the phone calls you know you need to make. This is more than just a YouTube channel. It's a place where people who believe in the possibility of healing can support each other through the scary but beautiful process of choosing love over fear, reconciliation over resentment, hope over the safety of familiar pain. The man in white reached into another pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded thousands of times over the years, the kind of document that gets handled with the reverence people reserve for sacred artifacts that hold pieces of their heart between creased lines of faded ink. This is the letter your father wrote to you on your birthday last year, Harold. He writes one every year on September 15th, same as he's been doing since 1982, but he never sends them because he's convinced you hate him too much to want to hear from him. Taking the letter with trembling hands, I unfolded it carefully in the dim light provided by the bus's interior cabin lights, and my father's familiar handwriting immediately transported me back to childhood memories of grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator, homework corrections penciled in the margins of my school papers, and birthday cards signed with the same distinctive signature that appeared at the bottom of this 42-year collection of unsent apologies. The words hit me like physical blows, each sentence revealing decades of guilt, regret, and longing that mirrored my own emotional landscape with devastating accuracy. "My dear son Harold," the letter began, "today you turn 66 years old and I'm 88, which means we've spent more years apart than we spent together as a family, and that breaks my heart in ways I don't have words to describe. I wake up every morning thinking about the things I said to you in anger, the way I made you feel like your dreams were somehow less important than mine, the way I let my disappointment turn into cruelty that drove you away from home and kept you away for all these years. If I could take back every harsh word, every moment I made you feel like you weren't good enough just as you were, I would trade everything I've ever owned or accomplished for just one more conversation where we could start over, and I could tell you how proud I am of the man you became, despite my failures as a father." The letter continued for 2 full pages, detailing memories I thought only I had preserved, acknowledging mistakes I never expected him to recognize, and expressing a depth of love and regret that made it clear he'd spent the past 4 decades replaying our relationship and wondering how things might have been different if he'd been wiser, more patient, more willing to let his son follow his own path, instead of trying to force him down a predetermined route that served the father's dreams rather than the son's happiness. "I know you became a teacher, Harold, and I know you spent 32 years helping children learn and grow, which means you chose to spend your life giving to others what I failed to give you, the support and encouragement every young person deserves when they're trying to figure out who they're meant to be. I've been following your career from a distance, through mutual acquaintances and newspaper articles about your school's achievements, and every story I've heard about your dedication to your students makes me prouder than I ever was of any construction project we completed together." Reading those words in the darkness of the Arizona desert, surrounded by infinite silence, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes calling across the vast emptiness, I realized that my father and I had been carrying the same burden of regret for 43 years. Both of us too proud and too afraid to make the first move toward reconciliation, both of us assuming the other was happy to maintain the silence that had grown between us like a cancer that fed on itself until it seemed too large. And too old to survive surgical removal. The stranger watched patiently while I absorbed the contents of the letter, his presence somehow both comforting and mysterious in ways that defied rational explanation. "How long has he been sick?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer, because it would add urgency to a situation I wasn't emotionally prepared to handle with the speed that medical emergencies demand from family members who've been absent for decades. "The stroke happened 18 months ago," he replied gently. "It affected his speech and his mobility, but his mind is still sharp, still filled with all the memories of the son he lost to his own stubborn pride and the grandchildren he never got to meet because he was too ashamed to reach out and ask for forgiveness. He spends his days in physical therapy, trying to regain enough strength to travel, because his greatest hope is that he'll be able to come looking for you before it's too late to make amends." The mention of grandchildren hit me like a revelation, because I'd never considered how my estrangement from my father had rippled outward to affect relationships he'd never even had the chance to develop. My wife Sarah had died of cancer 12 years earlier, and we'd never had children, partly by choice and partly due to fertility issues we'd faced throughout our marriage. But my father didn't know any of that personal history, because I'd cut off all communication before those major life events had occurred. In his mind, I was probably living somewhere with a family he'd never met, grandchildren he'd never held, a daughter-in-law he'd never had the opportunity to welcome into what remained of the Thompson family legacy. "There's something else you need to understand, Harold," the man continued, his voice taking on an urgency that suggested we were approaching the most important part of whatever message he'd come to deliver. "Your father isn't the only person at Golden Years Care Facility who's been waiting for news from the outside world. There's a nurse there named Margaret Chen who's been working the evening shift for the past 3 years, and she's the one who sits with your father when he can't sleep, who listens to his stories about the son he misses, who brings him the newspaper clippings about your school's academic achievements that she finds in the Sedona Library's archives." Something in the way he mentioned this Margaret person made my heart skip in a way I hadn't experienced since my wife Sarah's final months, when every conversation was weighted with the knowledge that our time together was running out and every moment needed to carry the love of a lifetime. Margaret has been divorced for 15 years, lost her own father to Alzheimer's 5 years ago, and she understands what it means to live with regret about things left unsaid and opportunities missed because pride got in the way of love. She's 59 years old, has grown children who live in California, and she spends her free time reading to patients who don't get visitors, writing letters for people whose hands shake too much to hold a pen, and serving as surrogate family for elderly residents whose real families have forgotten that love doesn't stop mattering just because someone gets old and needs help with daily activities. The description of this woman I'd never met somehow painted a picture that resonated with the kind of person I'd always hoped to find after Sarah's death, but had given up looking for because starting over in your 60s seemed too complicated and too risky when you'd already experienced the kind of love that comes along once in a lifetime if you're lucky. Why are you telling me about this nurse? What does she have to do with my situation with my father? The man smiled with an expression that suggested he knew something I hadn't figured out yet, the kind of knowing look that implies the best parts of a story are still coming, and the listener just needs to be patient enough to let them unfold naturally. Margaret has been reading your father's unsent letters, Harold. With his permission, of course, because he needed someone to help him understand whether the words he'd written captured what he really wanted to say to you if he ever got the chance. She's the one who encouraged him to keep writing them even when he despaired of ever sending them. The one who convinced him that someday you might find your way back to each other if he just held on to hope long enough. As the desert night deepened around us, and the temperature began its gradual descent toward the coolness that makes the southwestern wilderness bearable, the man in white continued to share details about my father's life that painted a picture of profound loneliness mixed with stubborn hope, daily routine structured around the possibility of reconciliation, and a love that had survived 43 years of silence without diminishing into resentment or indifference. Every morning at Golden Years, your father wakes up at 5:30 and asks Margaret if today might be the day you come to visit. Every evening before he goes to sleep, he tells her about a different memory of you as a child, a different moment he wishes he could relive with more wisdom and less need to control outcomes he was never meant to control. The weight of this information was almost unbearable, because it forced me to confront the reality that while I'd been nursing my own wounds and justifying my silence as a form of self-protection, my father had been waiting with the kind of patience that comes from unconditional love, never giving up hope that somehow, someday we'd find our way back to each other despite all the years and hurt feelings that had accumulated between us like debris after a flood. Margaret has been trying to convince him to let her help locate you, but he's always refused because he's convinced you left Arizona specifically to get away from him, and he doesn't want to disrespect your choice to stay away by forcing contact you don't want. The irony was devastating, because I hadn't left Arizona to escape my father. I'd simply taken a teaching job in Flagstaff right after college and never bothered to mention it to him, because our relationship had already deteriorated to the point where sharing personal information felt like offering ammunition to someone who'd already wounded me too deeply for easy forgiveness. For 4 decades, we'd been living less than 60 miles apart, close enough to have repaired our relationship with a single conversation, but separated by pride and assumptions that kept us isolated in parallel universes of regret and longing. The night your bus broke down was not an accident, Harold, the stranger said with absolute certainty, his words carrying the kind of authority that made questioning them seem pointless. This moment, this conversation, this opportunity for you to understand what's waiting for you in Sedona, all of it has been carefully orchestrated by forces that understand love is more important than pride. Forgiveness is more powerful than resentment, and time is too precious to waste on stubbornness that serves no one and heals nothing. As if to emphasize his point, the headlights of the approaching tow truck appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they navigated the curves of the desert highway, and I realized that rescue was coming exactly when I needed it most, exactly when I'd received all the information necessary to make the decision I should have made years ago, but had been too afraid and too proud to contemplate until this mysterious encounter forced me to see my situation clearly for the first time since 1981. Your ride is coming, Harold, but you have a choice to make about your destination. The tow truck driver can take you home to Flagstaff, where you can continue living the same life you've been living for the past 43 years. Or he can take you to Sedona, where your father is waiting for the son he's never stopped loving, despite all the years and silence and missed opportunities that have kept you apart. The approaching truck's engine noise grew steadily louder, accompanied by the distinctive rumble of heavy-duty equipment designed for highway emergencies, and I knew I had perhaps 2 minutes to make the most important decision of my adult life, a choice that would either heal the deepest wound in my heart or condemn me to carry my regrets to my own grave, without ever knowing what reconciliation might have felt like, or what my father's embrace might have meant after so many years of imagining. It was lost forever. What about my job, my house, my responsibilities in Flagstaff? I heard myself asking, though the questions sounded hollow even to me, because I knew that none of those practical concerns could outweigh the opportunity to repair the most important relationship of my life, while there was still time to make amends and build something new from the foundation of love that had never actually disappeared, despite being buried under decades of hurt feelings and stubborn silence. The man in white began walking away as the tow truck pulled up behind my disabled bus, its emergency lights painting the desert landscape in alternating patterns of red and amber that made everything look surreal, dreamlike, as if this entire encounter existed in some liminal space between ordinary reality and the realm of miracles, where impossible things become inevitable when love finally finds a way to overcome the barriers that human pride constructs to protect wounded hearts from further injury. "Your father forgives you, Harold," he called back over his shoulder, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air, despite the growing distance between us. "The only question now is whether you can forgive yourself enough to accept the gift of a second chance that most people never get." By the time the tow truck driver had positioned his vehicle and activated the winch mechanism needed to load my bus, the man in white had disappeared completely into the darkness, leaving no trace of his presence except for the letter that was still clutched in my hands and the photograph that had somehow found its way into my shirt pocket without me remembering how it got there. The driver, a weathered man in his 50s named Jake, who'd clearly spent decades rescuing stranded travelers from this unforgiving stretch of highway, looked around the empty desert with obvious puzzlement. "Was there someone else out here with you?" Jake asked, as he secured the bus to his equipment. "I could have sworn I saw 2 figures when I was driving up, but now I just see you standing here alone." I looked around the vast emptiness that stretched in all directions under the star-filled sky, searching for any sign of the stranger who delivered the most important message of my life. But there was nothing visible except endless desert and the distant silhouettes of mountains against the horizon. "There was a man here," I said slowly, though even as I spoke the words, I began to doubt my own memory of the past hour. He knew things about my father, about our family situation, things that should have been impossible for a stranger to know. Jake nodded with the patient expression of someone who'd heard plenty of strange stories from people who'd been stranded alone in the desert longer than they'd expected. "This stretch of I-40 has a reputation for unusual encounters, especially at night when the heat and isolation can play tricks on your mind. Where do you want me to take you and your bus? I can have you back in Flagstaff by midnight, or if you need to go somewhere else, that's fine too." Standing there in the desert darkness, with my father's letter in my hands and a choice to make, that would determine the rest of my life. I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and hurt that I'd been carrying for so long. It had become part of my identity, as fundamental to who I was as my name or my profession, or my memories of my late wife Sarah. For 43 years, I'd defined myself partly as the son who'd been rejected by his father, the young man whose dreams had been dismissed as foolish rebellion, the child who'd grown up thinking that love came with conditions and approval, had to be earned through compliance with other people's expectations rather than freely given based on the simple fact of existing and being family. "Take me to Sedona," I told Jake, my voice stronger and more certain than it had been in decades. "Take me to the Golden Years Care Facility on Oak Creek Drive. I have someone there I need to see, someone I should have visited a long time ago, someone who's been waiting for me to come home even though I was too stubborn and too hurt, and too afraid to realize that home was always there whenever I was ready to claim it." The ride to Sedona through the winding mountain roads that connected the high desert to the red rock country took almost 2 hours, giving me plenty of time to read and reread my father's letter, to process everything the mysterious stranger had told me, and to prepare myself emotionally for a reunion that felt both inevitable and terrifying in ways that made my heart race with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Jake, sensing that his passenger was dealing with something profound and personal, kept conversation to a minimum, occasionally pointing out landmarks or commenting on road conditions, but mostly respecting the silence that allowed me to wrestle with 4 decades of accumulated feelings that suddenly needed sorting and organizing and understanding before I could face the man who'd brought me into the world, and then watched helplessly as I walked out of it in a storm of mutual wounded pride. Golden Years Care Facility turned out to be a modern, well-maintained building surrounded by the kind of carefully planned landscaping that's designed to provide beauty and tranquility for people whose daily lives have been reduced to waiting for visits that may never come, medical appointments that bring news they don't want to hear, and the slow passage of time that carries them steadily away from everything they've known and loved throughout their younger years. At 11:30 at night, the facility was quiet except for the soft sounds of night shift activity, nurses checking on patients, the distant murmur of late-night television programs, and the subtle mechanical noises that accompany institutional care for people who can no longer live independently. The woman at the front desk looked surprised to see a visitor arriving so late, but when I explained who I was and why I'd come, her expression immediately softened into the kind of professional compassion that people develop when they work with elderly patients whose family relationships are complicated by years of unresolved conflicts and missed opportunities. "Mr. Thompson has been waiting for this visit for as long as I've worked here," she said gently. "He's awake, actually. He rarely sleeps through the night anymore, and Margaret is with him right now, reading from one of his favorite books." Following her directions down a carpeted hallway lined with artwork clearly created by residents who were finding ways to express creativity and maintain dignity, despite the physical limitations that had brought them to institutional care, I felt my nervousness increase with every step toward room 247, where my father was spending what might be some of his final years, waiting for a son who'd taken 43 years to find the courage to come home. The door was slightly open, and I could hear 2 voices inside, one frail and uncertain, the other warm and patient, engaged in the kind of gentle conversation that happens between people who've learned to find comfort in each other's company during the long, quiet hours when loneliness threatens to overwhelm even the strongest spirits. "Robert, you should try to get some sleep," the woman's voice was saying. "It's getting late and you need your rest for physical therapy tomorrow morning." The response came in my father's voice, older and weaker than I remembered, but still recognizably his, still carrying the distinctive tone and cadence that had been the soundtrack of my childhood, before anger and disappointment changed everything between us into something unrecognizable and painful. "I can't sleep, Margaret. I keep thinking about Harold, wondering if he's happy, if he ever thinks about the old man who loved him so much but was too foolish and too proud to tell him so when it mattered most. Do you think there's any chance he might forgive me someday? Any possibility that he might want to have a father again, even one who made so many mistakes and hurt him so deeply?" Standing in the doorway, I could see them both clearly for the first time. My father, smaller and frailer than I'd expected, but still unmistakably the man who'd taught me to use tools, who'd shown me the satisfaction of building something useful with my own hands, who'd worked impossible hours to provide for his family, and had dreams of working alongside his son that I'd shattered with my announcement about choosing education over construction. And Margaret, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair who was holding my father's hand, with the tenderness of someone who understood that human connection was often the most important medicine available to people who were facing the reality of their own mortality. "Your father forgives you," I said quietly, stepping into the room and using the exact words the mysterious stranger had spoken to me in the desert, "and he's been waiting for you to come home." The recognition in my father's eyes was immediate and overwhelming, 43 years of separation collapsing into a single moment of connection that felt like stepping back into a relationship that had been interrupted rather than destroyed, temporarily set aside rather than permanently broken. "Harold?" he whispered, struggling to sit up straighter in his bed. "Is it really you? Are you really here, or am I dreaming again?" I crossed the room quickly and took his other hand, feeling the familiar calluses that spoke of decades of construction work, noticing how much smaller and more fragile he seemed, but recognizing the strength that still remained in his grip when he held on to me like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. "I'm here, Dad. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry for all the years we lost, all the conversations we didn't have, all the times I should have called or visited or just let you know that I never stopped loving you, even when I was too hurt and too angry to admit it to myself. Margaret quietly excused herself to give us privacy, but not before I caught her eye and saw something there that made me understand why the stranger in the desert had mentioned her specifically, why her role in my father's life was important, not just for his well-being, but potentially for mine as well. "I'll be at the nurse's station if you need anything," she said softly. "Take all the time you need. This conversation has been 43 years in the making." The next 3 hours passed like minutes, as my father and I talked through everything that had happened since our final argument in 1981, sharing stories about careers and marriages and losses and dreams, filling in the details of lives that had continued to unfold despite the silence between us, discovering that love had indeed survived the separation and was stronger now for having endured the test of time and distance and wounded pride. I told him about my career in education, about Sarah and our marriage and her death, about the emptiness that had defined my life since losing her, about how meeting the stranger in the desert had finally given me the courage to come home. He told me about his business success and eventual retirement, about the stroke that had changed his physical capabilities but sharpened his understanding of what really mattered, about Margaret, and how her kindness had helped him maintain hope during the darkest periods of missing his son, about the letters he'd written and never sent, and the prayers he'd offered for my happiness and safety, even when he didn't know where I was or whether I ever thought about him anymore. As dawn began to lighten the windows of room 247, my father fell asleep holding my hand, and Margaret returned with coffee and the kind of gentle smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this reunion almost as long as he had. "He talks about you constantly," she told me quietly. "Every patient here knows about Harold Thompson, the son who became a teacher, the boy who loved to build things with his father before life got complicated, and family relationships became battlegrounds instead of safe havens." Over the following weeks, I arranged for early retirement from my teaching position and relocated to Sedona to be closer to my father during his recovery and rehabilitation. Margaret and I began spending time together outside of the care facility, discovering that we shared interests in hiking and reading and quiet conversations about the kinds of deep subjects that become important when you've lived long enough to understand that time is precious and should never be wasted on superficial concerns or temporary distractions. 6 months later, my father was able to attend our small wedding ceremony in the gardens behind Golden Years, where he served as my best man, and Margaret's children from California served as witnesses to a love story that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances, but had grown into something beautiful and lasting through shared commitment to caring for people who needed support during vulnerable chapters of their lives. Today, 3 years after that mysterious encounter on Interstate 40, my father is 89 years old and living in a small apartment near Margaret and me, healthy enough to join us for weekly dinners and holiday celebrations, strong enough to hold his great-grandchildren when Margaret's kids visit with their families, happy enough to spend his days woodworking in the garage workspace we've set up for him, creating toys and furniture, and small gifts that carry his love forward to another generation of family members he thought he'd lost forever. And here's what I want you to understand as we come to the end of this story. Every single moment of healing that followed that desert breakdown happened because I finally found the courage to choose love over pride, forgiveness over resentment, action over the familiar safety of nursing old wounds that served no purpose except to keep me isolated from the people who mattered most. The man in white, whether he was a divine messenger or a figment of my desert-stressed imagination or something else entirely, delivered exactly the message I needed to hear at exactly the moment I was ready to receive it and act on it. If this story has moved something in your heart, if it's reminded you of your own unfinished family business, or your own opportunities for second chances that you've been too afraid or too proud to pursue, I want you to know that you've found a community of people who understand that it's never too late to come home, never too late to ask for forgiveness, never too late to discover that love has been waiting patiently for us to grow wise enough and brave enough to claim it. We share these stories because they remind us that miracles happen when ordinary people make extraordinary choices to prioritize relationship over reputation, connection over correctness, healing over the stubborn satisfaction of being right about old grievances that hurt everyone and help no one. Subscribe to this channel not because you want to be entertained, but because you believe in the power of human beings to change, to grow, to forgive, to love deeply even after experiencing profound hurt, to create families and connections that transcend blood relationships and legal definitions and social expectations. Leave a comment and tell us about the person you need to forgive, the conversation you've been avoiding, the phone call that could change everything if you just had the courage to dial the number. Share your own stories of unexpected encounters that changed your perspective, mysterious strangers who delivered important messages, dessert breakdowns that became spiritual breakthroughs, family relationships that got healed against all odds through the simple magic of choosing love over fear. This channel is more than just a place to watch videos. It's a community where people who believe in second chances can encourage each other to take the risks that lead to the most meaningful rewards life has to offer.